Hi, so today's reel is about something a little bit more practical, the term deficit. Now, we are going to discuss this deficit in light of what happened last week with the interim budget being presented by the government, and also in context to what it means for us, the fiscal deficit, and what our own personal financial deficit could be, and again, what that means for you. So let's talk about the government's fiscal deficit first. So the fiscal deficit, a lot of governments actually run fiscal deficits, and in a growing and developing economy like India, it's really a given that there is going to be some kind of a deficit, right? Because there is so much to spend on when you're developing the country. What does the government really spend on? So yes, our government does spend a little bit on health and education, very little. There are things like defense, which is a major spend of the government. There is railways, which is another major spend of the government. Then the government pays its own employees and has to fund their pensions. That's also something. And then there is, what we call capital expenditure, like roads and institutions, etc. And some portion of it also goes to paying dues on loans that they have already taken. So, by and large, this is what the government spends on. Where is the government getting its money from to spend on all this? Well, so roughly about 60% of the government's revenue actually comes from taxes, both direct and indirect taxes. Indirect taxes are things like GST, custom duties, etc. And direct taxes are like, your income tax. So most of it comes from taxes. Some of it comes from other things like dividends, interest, and, all kinds of other receipts that the government is getting. So, your taxes, the taxes that you are paying to the government are actually funding expenses that the government is making. Now, what about this deficit? Now, if the government is spending more than it's earning, then where is it getting that excess money from? From borrowing. Okay, so they borrow in the country also, they borrow from outside the country, from other countries as well. Now, you don't want this borrowing to go on increasing year after year, because that kind of fuels inflation, that kind of increases the portion of the government spending which is already going to interest on past loans, and that's a huge chunk. I think it's roughly between, 1/5 or 1/6 of the government expenditure goes on these interests, and you don't want that increasing, because also then it will start to put pressure on the currency, and no longer will we have a competitive currency, and again, export pricing will change, etc. So there are a lot of issues with actually increasing the fiscal deficit, because it means increasing borrowing. The government has to be smart. Now, what does it do if it wants to increase its income so that the fiscal deficit is in balance? Well, as I told you, 60% of the revenue comes from taxes. So, the low-hanging fruit really is increased taxes, and that can hurt you and me. So if you read somewhere that the government's fiscal deficit has increased substantially, then you should worry, because it is going to have an impact on the money you take home, because taxes are most likely to increase. There are other things the government can do, and in this time, there was talk of disinvestment. So the government also has assets in public sector companies, and if they sell some of those assets, they can make money. They also get dividends from those assets. They make interest income through other sources as well. So those are some sources of income that if the government focuses on, they can make money from, especially disinvestment, but we have not seen much happening there. The other things that the government can do is maybe reduce its expenditure, right? We are talking about how it can get income. Now, another way to reduce fiscal deficit is to reduce expenditure. And one of the things that they can do, other than, cutting back on their direct expenses like paying employees and pensions, etc., is, encourage more private industry to get into large scale projects which are for the benefit of the country, like railways and roads, capital expenditure, etc., which some of it is happening. And if more of it happens, then the government can manage to keep its fiscal kind of management in a good place and maintain its fiscal deficit at a low point. So that's how the fiscal deficit of the government actually matters to you and to your money and to the taxes that you're going to pay. But also let's understand that like a government, even we have income and we have expenses. And if we continue to go overboard with our expenses, we are going to run a deficit. Now, the government can fund its deficit by borrowing more because it's a sovereign, and those lines are quite open. When you go out to borrow more, you have to repay that EMI from the limited income you have. The government, remember, can also increase its income by increasing taxes. And governments have a last resort of printing currency. Now that does bring in inflation, but they have that last resort. You and me don't. So if we keep increasing our deficit, we have nowhere to hide like governments do in taxes and, printing currency. We have to really repay or we'll go bankrupt. So we don't have that option of, maintaining a fiscal deficit. Ideally, we should have income which is greater than our expenses and not a fiscal deficit. So that's today's reel, where we spoke about deficit and how it matters to governments, how it matters to you, the government's deficit and your own deficit. I hope that is of some help and you do realize that living in debt is not an option for individuals as it is for governments.